Okay, so welcome to the final discussion of
Can you hit that button?
Plato's Symposium.
Got it.
Now,
Is it a touchscreen?
Maybe not.
please feel free to
Might need to use the
bring up any questions you have about anything thus far.
Yeah, you'll need to use
Otherwise, we'll just dive into the middle of Socrates' speech and sprint our way through to the end of the dialogue, and then have whatever discussion you would like to have.
Where are we?
I'm saying we're at 207A. So there's fairly clear markers, as usual, for shifts in the dialogue. I might just actually put this on the board. That might help. I'll just undertake this pinning exercise. So we have Phaedrus, Pausanias, Eryximachus, Aristophanes, Agathon, and Socrates. And then Socrates' speech, well, his speaking, he replaces the speech with dialogue. So first, dialogue with Agathon. Actually, I apologize. The first thing he does is say, I shouldn't have done this because I didn't know how to. I thought that when you praise someone, you had to say something true. So, but you have all just piled up lies, and he means lies because he's saying you know the truth, but you know it's ugly. So you've beautified Eros. That's his complaint. And then he has a dialogue with Agathon, and then a dialogue with Diotima. And that has three parts. First of all, the description of Eros, since he's established with Agathon that Eros is not beautiful but longs for the beautiful. And he identifies the beautiful and the good and says, well, therefore, he's not good but longs for the beautiful. So he's neither good nor beautiful. And if he's not, say, beautiful, then he must be ugly. And he leaves Agathon at that moment, goes to Diotima to establish that, well, if he's not those things, he's not a god. But neither are the other gods. There are no gods. We've established that, right? We've hinted at that, not established it so much. Now, then he says, so he defines Eros as an in-between, and his two main paradigms, there's a myth, Poros and Penia. There's one paradigm which is right opinion, because right opinion is right, it touches on the truth, but it's only opinion because it can't give a logos of it. And then he discusses Eros as philosophy, the assumption, not the assumption, but that these are the same. Philosophy is somehow right opinion. And that's why he says, my wisdom is as disputable as a dream, because my wisdom is an image of the whole, not grounded in irrefutable foundations or some such thing. But that's why it's dialectical. It always begins with opinions. If you begin with opinions, you can't end with, foundational, provable truth, didactic demonstration, and so on. Then he says, well, what's the cause? So the cause is the human desire for the good, and that turns immediately into the desire to produce, to beget in the beautiful, by means of the beautiful, and because of the beautiful. Right? Now then, we get to the end of Eros in the last section, and so that's all seems fairly clear. And then after that, Alcibiades breaks in. So we have 7 speeches, and the central speech is about the love of one's own, about the desire to be whole. Right? And that's what's attacked and then elided in Socrates' speech. Right? He brings it up to say, no, we don't desire the whole, we desire the good. Right? But that's partly true, but we desire the good for us. So he elides that, and that leaves Aristophanes as being the central opposing position. So there's 7 speeches.
Martin, whilst you're up there on the whiteboard, may I interrupt?
Yeah, please.
Are you able to very succinctly give the core of each one of those people, 1 to 5? In other words,
yeah, I can make a reminder. I don't know if I'll get to the core of it at this instant, but Phaedrus begins with the non-reciprocal character. So love is non-reciprocal. And it's useful. It's useful for the beloved, right? So the aim is what's good for the beloved. Now, Pausanias and Eryximachus, they want to have a love that's somehow reciprocal, but it's very uneven, right? Because what you basically have is pleasure. Pausanias is saying, pleasure for virtue. It's an exchange. And Eryximachus is saying pleasure is brought to you by art. Art is for the sake of pleasure. Aristophanes, love is not of the beautiful. He doesn't mention the word beauty or beautiful, which is astonishing. He gives an extremely powerful speech about love. When Diotima sums things up here, just in passing, she says, you people who are in love with your beloved, you want to be with and look upon. So there's 2 irreconcilable aspects to eros. Be with, which means anything from conversation to sexual intercourse. Be with, to be one with, right? And to look upon, which requires separation from the lover and the beloved. Those are 2 different things. The looking upon, that has to do with beauty. And this has to do with wholeness and being one's own. Like the sense of intimacy, which is another way of saying one's own. Right? That's what Aristophanes gets rid of beauty and looking upon, and he defines the eros as the desire for being whole. But it's underlying his comedy of these little parts wandering around trying to find their other parts is obviously the tragic truth that you cannot ever meet your other half. I mean, technically in the story, first of all, it seems fairly clear that the other halves immediately died off. And that's why Apollo had to stretch around the skin, and there was all this spare skin because the skin was not required for the dead half. Right? That's just a hint. But also, once the first generation has passed, there's no longer any genuine other halves. And also, by the end of the speech, he makes it very clear that to make ourselves whole is to make ourselves these unlawful, barbaric creatures that want to overthrow the divinities that make us what we are. Right? Because there's the whole creatures who had the round, circular cosmological gods. We are now the human beings whose anthropomorphic gods provide the laws that make us what we are. So if we were erotic, genuine, and cleaved our eros, we would destroy ourselves as human beings. Right? So it's impossible. So it's a comedy on top of a tragedy, which comes in at the end of the dialogue when we talk about comedy and tragedy. But Agathon does 2 things. He makes a god, the God has these and those attributes, and that's the Socrates will come back to this in a moment. And he also says that Eros is of ta color, the beautiful things, the noble things, i.e. not the beautiful beloved. It's the desire for nobility in the sense of splendor, fame, glory. So he's the first person to say that there's an eros for something beyond the passionate desire for another person. Right? Then we have Socrates, and yeah, so he's in dialogue mostly with the two poets. Okay, we'll come back to the board when we get to the beautiful and the good, because that's also complex enough to require a little bit of diagrams and... Okay. So just to read a couple of passages in the middle of Socrates' speech, we did get past 207a, where we move into the second part. But I wanted to read, I think we got just to here, and I'm going to read from 207a, the paragraph break, where he says, all these things, right? Here, roughly. All these things, then, she would teach me whenever she made arguments about love matters. And once she asked, what do you think, Socrates, is the cause of this love and desire? Or don't you perceive the terrible condition that all beasts are in? Okay, all animals, including the humans, are in a condition that she compares to being sick and being mad, A, to have intercourse, and B, to nourish the young, right? Now, that's not going to be a model for philosophy, because she's specifically describing it as being mindless, right? So it's not the model, but it's the first step in her showing how the desire for beauty is a subset of the desire for the good and what that includes. So begetting in the widest possible sense. And then at C, she says, just the last line at C1 is, what is the cause of the beasts being in the grip of eros, of love, in this way? Can you tell me? So what's the cause of the unconscious desire? So we completely agree with Freud at this point and abandon him shortly hereafter. But at this point, of course, there is this unconscious desire motivating the living being to leave behind another like itself, to use Aristotle's helpful phrase. Okay. Socrates says, once again, I said I didn't know. And she said, do you suppose you'll ever become an expert in love matters, that is, skilled in erotic things, which he claimed at the beginning of the dialogue, if you don't reflect on these things? And he says, but look, Diotima, as I said just now, that's why I've come to you, because I know I need teachers. So there's neediness, and there's awareness of a lack, and a seeking to fill that lack by learning. That's completely different from an unconscious desire, right? So he's accomplished, at this point, part of what eros was defined as, which is an awareness of a lack, right? As opposed to, he said the most difficult thing about people who are ignorant is not that they know nothing, but that they're satisfied with their opinions, right? So he knows his opinions are defective, and he's seeking a teacher. So that's a kind of self-knowledge not possessed by the people who are happy with their opinions. Okay, so she says, now this is, I think we should read this passage because it's a very interesting Socratic stroke Diotiman stroke Platonic reflection on the mutability of everything. So we start from that. I mean, there's a 7-word phrase in the Republic: everything that comes into being passes out of being. Right? So then what's the character of the structure, form, character, intelligibility, of the things that allow us to understand the things that are coming into being at the passing away, because things aren't a sheer buzz of chaos. You know, the way Kant describes the material word as a buzzing, seething. It doesn't say white noise because they didn't have that phrase. Anyway, so she says, well then, if you trust that love is by nature for the thing we've often agreed about, now why is she saying that? Why is she not just saying, haven't we agreed that love is A, for the beautiful, and then B, for the good? Which one? She's just, for some reason, not specifying that. And I think that's so, because she has already stated that, and I won't go back there, but I'll just tell you, at 205D, right? In sum, all desire for good things and for being happy is, quote, eros, both exceedingly great and all-beguiling. Why? Because what we recognize as genuine eros is always for the beautiful, not for the good, right? So this is part of what she's going to explain, why we have an erotic passion for an appearance of what is beautiful when we actually at base desire what's good. Okay, so but the basis of that, the ground of that, is this following description of our mutability and mortality. Okay, but she also says, and this is the third, not the third time, but one of the three places where she says, don't wonder, cease to philosophize. And he calls her a sophist, someone who pretends to wisdom. So if we had a year, we would pick apart how what she is saying seems to be a claim to wisdom, whilst what he takes from it is his aphoretic, non-wise apprehension of the whole. Okay, for it's the same account in this case as in the others. The mortal nature, insofar as it's able, seeks to be always and to be immortal. So she had started from arguing that we always desire the good, to concluding that we desire to be always. Right? Okay, but it's only able by this generation, in that it always leaves behind another that's new in place of the old. That's extremely close to the Aristotelian formulation of living things want to leave behind another of the same sort as themselves. Not themselves, because you can't do that, another of the same sort. Consider the time during which each living thing is said to be alive and the same. For instance, someone is said to be the same from when he's a child to when he becomes an old man, yet though he is called the same, he never has the same things in himself. He's always being generated new as he suffers destruction in his hair and flesh and bone and blood and his whole body. I believe that the longest lasting, hard bones that we have are about 7 years, and then they're all completely replaced. So there's nothing that lasts beyond that period. For instance, down to E, and not just in his body, but also in his soul, his ways, traits, opinions, desires, pleasures, pains, fears. Now there's 7 of those: ways, traits, opinions, desires, pleasures, pains, fears. And the 4th is desires. Each of these is never present in the same way in each of us, but instead they're coming to be in one respect while perishing in another. And something still more bizarre is that in the case of the various kinds of knowledge, and knowledge is meant to be by definition of that which is, right? Knowledge too, not only just some of the kinds of knowledge. You can't say knowledges in English, but you can in Greek. You could say sciences. Some of the sciences come to be in us, while others perish, and we're never the same with respect to them. But also each one of the kinds of knowledge is affected in the same way. For what's called practicing or studying takes place because knowledge is going out, since forgetting is the exit of knowledge, and practice or study, by implanting a new memory for one that's going away, preserves knowledge, so that it seems to be one and the same. Right, so we are, in every aspect of ourselves, ephemeral, changing. So this is the manner in which everything mortal is preserved, not by being altogether the same forever, as is the divine. Now, what is the same forever and therefore divine in Plato? Not the gods. The gods are running around, beating up the humans they don't like, having affairs with cows. Right? The forms, right? That's the only understanding that would fit here. Right? The atemporal, intelligible character of things, that would maybe fit. But insofar as what's going away and growing old leaves behind something new and different that's like it, that's the way in which a mortal thing is preserved, by leaving something of the same sort. By this device, so this is a device, right? Not a conscious deliberation. By this device, Socrates, she said, the mortal partakes of immortality, both in body and in all other respects, but the immortal by another way. Don't be surprised then if everything by nature holds its own offshoot, what it's begotten, right, in honor. So that brings in honor. So we start with the desire to be always, and then honor seems to come in accidentally, the respect that one has for one's own productions. Since this very eagerness and love for immortality attends everything. Now, the next step is going to be honor. Now, Socrates says, I was amazed and spoke out, "Oh, wisest Diotima, is this how it is?" And just like our perfect sophist, she said, yeah, absolutely. Right. So for some reason, he's characterizing her as wise and a sophist. Now, so she's discussed the desire to beget, to leave behind another like oneself, as a way of participating in what is always of a mortal being. And that's the first level. Everything desires that unconsciously. There's not a deliberation, right? The next step is, and that leads, though, us to honor things, the things that we've made. In the beginning of the Republic, there's this, in part of the conversation, Socrates says, "Are you, Cephalus, you don't seem to me to be like those people who make lots of money and that they love money too much, in the same way that poets love their poems and parents love their children." So in each case, what you make becomes the object of your honor. Right? Now, in this stage is the desire for honor itself. So if you're willing to take a look, this is at C2, since if you're willing to take a look at the love of honor among humans, you would be amazed at the irrationality of what I was saying, unless you think about it and consider how terribly affected they are by the love of making a name for themselves and of laying up immortal glory for time everlasting. So again, she is saying the behavior looks irrational in the same way that the production of offspring is not a rational activity like a mathematical theorem, right? It comes from a sub-rational impulse, but as an expression of a desire for what's good in this understanding. And the same about the desire for honor. It's not in itself a rational thing to go charging at the enemy in order to lay up a mortal glory. But she says here at D, for laying up a mortal glory, they're ready to run all risks, even more than for their children. Right? And to spend money and to labor at all labors whatsoever and to die for its sake. And then she mentions Alcestis, who was in Phaedrus' speech, Achilles, who was also in Phaedrus' speech, and Codrus, who was not in Phaedrus' speech, and whose story I completely forget. Yeah. In any case, these people wouldn't have acted this way if they weren't supposing that they would have an immortal memory for excellence, for virtue. Right. Now, this is in this sort of Platonic understanding of things, people basically desire what's good for themselves. what's good for themselves ends up comprehending much greater wholes. So the good of the whole people is part of the good of the lawgiver, because they want the people to be genuinely excellent and happy, because that will make their fame greater. But that doesn't require them to be, what's that, altruistic, that you only think of the other. You're thinking of the other as part of yourself. Okay?
Martin,
Yes.
where I don't know whether I've missed it or whether it's coming later or whether it ever comes up, but when Diotima is talking about the terrible condition of these beasts, and then asks Socrates, well, do you understand why? And then she goes, well, I'll tell you. And then, so she goes through that passage that we've just read, and then sort of quickly then, well, not quickly, but then moves on to these honors of notion, ending just now with an immortal memory for virtue and such like.
Yep.
Has she sort of moved on from the terrible beast and is now talking about only man, or is she actually attributing notions of honor and such like to beasts with their terrible condition for just wanting to procreate?
No, you're right. She's moved on. So all living creatures desire, to the inner impulse of everything alive is to leave behind another like itself.
Yeah. I just didn't quite see that distinction between when then she said, well, a man, however, has that, but then, people have that, but then we're more, and then introduce these notions of honor. I must have missed that in the text. I need to read it more closely.
Yeah, no, it's there are no subheadings at all. So, but it's C3 there, which he says, well, C2 to 3. Since if you're willing to take a look at the love of honor among humans. Now,
okay.
Yeah, but she has just used the word honor 4 or 5 lines above. About everything honoring its offspring in the way that animals do, like.
I think that's where I got it and started thinking about my question and stopped listening. Thank you.
Yeah, no, so she's moved a step, and this step takes us in a continuum, but it takes us from a continuation of another body, like the original body, to the continuation of a memory that involves notions of, specifically human notions of excellence and so on. So reproduction on the level of the body to reproduction, we have to say, on the level of the soul.
I can just ask a question about something that you were talking about 5 or 10 minutes ago on this thing. So it's a question about what was said earlier, that people replace themselves over time. They learn, they forget. The body grows, and when we get aged, we deteriorate and we die. So sort of this image of a little bit up and down, but certainly no stability. But to me, that's inconsistent with sort of the common sense that every human being has an identity. So even at 18, a guy kills someone, gets away with it, but 50 years later, when he's an old man, they find out. And the same person, so we'd say that even though his body's replaced itself, so 50 years later, he's still liable because of what he did when he was 18. And maybe he's become a good man and all the rest, but he's still responsible for what he did 50 years before. So isn't that common sense thing, which is maybe part of the law in most countries, I'd say, that's a little bit against the grain here, like against the grain of what she is saying, don't you think?
Well, she says we call them the same. Do you think that there is nothing that's the same? Yeah?
Well, I'd say there's an 80-year-old person, he or she can say, I'm still Mary Smith, as I was when I was 15. Yeah. I'm still the same. I've changed, I've learned, but I'm still Mary Smith.
Yeah. So, but what would appear to be the same is not having particular acts or particular no, I was going to say habits, but these are all the results of how you respond to the world. Yeah, your habits and your traits, and so that would have, like, so the fact that it's the same, I want to say the same eros, right? The same openness, and therefore admiration for some things, dislike of other things. That seems to be somehow the same, because everything that is possessed by this changing person is a result of that character. Character is the wrong word, because that's also something that changes, but yeah.
Martin,
Yeah.
isn't Diotima expressing a very good sense of the deconstruction of the subject? It seems a beautiful way of trying to move away from a unitary sovereign subject to a sense of subject which is very fluid.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I think we're struggling with. And I don't think that it's so much that it's, yeah, I would resist the notion that it's the subject per se, but after infinite qualifications about what the modern meaning of a subject is and so on. But I think there is something the same that is more fundamental than the characters and the traits and the bone. But she has listed all of these things that appear to be, that are attributes that we often take to be decisive for, you know, what someone is, and they're all fluid.
But doesn't she say that the soul changes in a similar way to the body changing?
All of these attributes of the soul's action do, like, you know, knowledge, habits. But if the soul is eros, then it's a kind of openness to the whole, right? That was the in-between phase. Then it's that openness, which is a kind of responsiveness to what's there. Eros binds together the whole with itself, right? So your comprehension of the whole of which you're a part, that openness could be in some sense the same, because it's responsible for all these acts of making. That's just a suggestion, could be completely false, but yeah. But so
Okay,
let's keep in mind these two. There are at least these, you know, two. There are infinite possibilities, but there are at least these two. One, there's nothing stable. There's no subject. That's one possibility from the way she's described things. The other is that it's not the result of acts of doing and making, like traits and so on. That doesn't constitute it. It's rather the openness that leads to that making, and that characterizes the individual. Yeah, so those are at least two possibilities so far. Okay, second to last line on 208D, she says, but I suppose all of them do everything they can for immortal virtue and such glorious renown. And the better they are, the more they do it. That is, the more erotic they are, the better they are, for they're in love with what's immortal. Now that obviously is going to be turned into the forms, the structure of being or whatever. Okay, so now those whose pregnancy is of the body turn more toward women and are erotic in this way. But then there are those whose pregnancy is of the soul, but who, she said, in their soul still more than in their body, still more. It's a matter of degrees. It's not a distinct, clear line. Conceive the things it befits the soul to conceive and bear. And what's that? Good sense, phrenesis, this is their translation of phrenesis, and the rest of excellence, the rest of human excellence or virtue. Now, yeah, so I want to read this passage and a paragraph further down. So she says, it is of these things, good, phronesis, intelligence, thoughtfulness, of these things that all the poets and all the craftsmen said to be inventive are procreators. And the greatest by far, she said, and the most beautiful part of phronesis, of good sense, of intelligence, is that which concerns the ordering of cities and households. Its name is moderation and justice. So we have, and she goes into a description here of someone who is, in her understanding, pregnant in the soul, meeting someone they find beautiful, and then here at just before C, she says, he's straight off fluent in speeches about excellence, about what sort a good man should be and what practices he should engage in, and attempts to educate this other person. All right. Now, this passage here gets a 4-page explication in the Phaedrus, another dialogue, where he has one person falls in love with another person and makes beautiful speeches, and because they fall in love, they're almost revere the other person as a god, and they make images of the god that they see in the other person for the other person to fall in love with. So what the other person falls in love with are images constructed in speech of themselves. But basic point, erotic attraction is sublimated into speech that is made, in the original sense, made sublime, not in the Freudian sense of diverted, right? But into speech about human excellence. Now, at the bottom of this page, at D, she gives us the decisive poetic example. Surely everyone would choose to have gotten for himself children like these rather than the human sort. So she's saying that there is there are obviously levels of immortality. And if one looks at Homer and Hesiod and the other good poets, one envies them the sort of offspring of themselves they've left behind, which provide these poets with immortal glory and memory, since their offspring are themselves immortal. Now, what are their offspring? The poems, possibly, or the gods, like Agathon made a god just before. That's the poetic is at the peak. And then she says, look at the sort of children Lycurgus left behind in Sparta. So, lawgivers in Sparta, those saviors of Sparta, right? And one might say of Greece. So the Lycurgus sets down the laws for the Spartans, which saved Greece and saved Sparta. And among you, Solon, who reorganized the Athenian laws in the 6th century BC, is honoured as well through his birthing of the laws. So we're still talking about begetting of laws or customs concerning what human excellence is as an indirect means to the immortality of the lawmaker. And so too are other men in other places everywhere, among Greeks and barbarians alike. So we're obviously talking about human nature, not, specifically the Greeks. Many shrines have now been raised for these men because of such children, but because of the human sort, not for anyone yet. Okay, so because of such children means basically for such children. So people have made shrines in Greece for the gods who are the children of Homer and Hesiod. So they have immortal children through their poems. Now, I just want to try and make a suggestion about the relation here between the beautiful and the good, if I can. So when she was talking with Agathon, she identified the beautiful and the good. But then when she talked about Eros as a daimonian, Eros had several traits, several characteristics. For example, homeless. Homeless means to be able to be not fully with one's own, which characterizes Socrates, right? In trying to think through everything that's not his own, in being open to the whole, he's not at home, and that's revealed in the last line of the dialogue when he went home. Everyone else is drunk and falls asleep. Right? He puts them to bed and then wanders off. Aristodemus falls asleep for the most important part of the dialogue when they discuss poetry. He wakes up at the end when Socrates is compelling Aristophanes and Agathon to agree that if someone can make tragedy by art, they can also make comedy. He doesn't say the other way around. If you can make comedy, you can make tragedy. Right? So somehow Agathon is more fundamental. Tragedy is more fundamental, presumably because that's where the gods come from. So Aristophanes makes this comedy in which he needs the Olympian gods, but he can't produce them. That's tragic poetry. And in Republic Book 10, Socrates says, he refers to Homer and he says, as the originator of all these tragic things. So it's epic poetry in form, but it's the tragic poem of the Greeks, in which the gods are made for the Greeks. And so tragedy is more fundamental than comedy in that sense. Okay, so, homeless, tough, sleeps outdoors, shoeless. Right, now these things, these are good. These are good to have, but they're not beautiful. Right, so you can have a good being that is seeking for the beautiful. So the good and the beautiful are not the same. Right? So she then says, immediately after this passage, says that everyone, is it not, it's clear even to a child, you fool, Socrates, everyone wants what's good. There are certain examples, like money making, and loving, and gymnastics, being in the gym all the time, getting huge, and philosophy that we do not call being in love. Right? And then the rest of the speech is to help us understand that, right? So that's the good. The whole is the good. Right? The people who we genuinely call lovers have something to do with the beautiful. But she uses this funny phrase, immortal beings want to be mortal beings want to participate in the immortal by begetting in the beautiful. Now, in the could mean by means of. Since this preposition and takes a dative, and it can mean by means of, and I'll just, okay. So what does she mean? Well, begetting in the beautiful is, if someone is erotically disposed and wants to leave behind another like themselves, it doesn't matter if it's a bird or a human or whatever, there is begetting offspring. But then she immediately moves to making speeches about human excellence and intelligence, virtue. Right. And on the lower level, we have the statesman, and on the highest level, we have the poets. So this explains to us why, when she said, why do we only call some people lovers, the people who are attracted to the beautiful? Well, because at their peak, the peak of the love of the beautiful is the poets, who beget by means of the beautiful, that is, they make noble pictures, noble paradigms which attract people to those ways, and they're the peak of the lovers. Now, philosophy operates, is the activity in the light of the good, not the beautiful, apparently. That appears to be completely reversed in the final section, which we're now just going to have a look at. But it appears to be wanting something good, right? And then what characterizes money making and athletics is that it's the good of the body. What characterizes philosophy is that it's the good of the soul. But all three of them operate fundamentally because they want some good, not to beget in the beautiful. Right, back to the text.
It's a very small point, something like money and gin, the desires for those things. I think there's an aspect of it that's desire not just in relation to the body, but desire in relation to honour, and also power, potentially. It's not just in relation to the body. I mean, it's fine dining is in relation to the body, but gym and making money, well, yeah, the gym is for the body, but you don't just do it to
You don't,
be alone.
you don't just do it to feel good, you actually do it to be admired. I'm astonished.
Yeah, but so it's not just so you can live in a cave with your abs,
No,
obviously.
yeah.
And the same with money. You don't just do it so you can buy lots of stuff. You do it so you can be bowed down to. It's right. It's not just like fine dining for both of those.
Yeah, but it's possible to have a lot of money and not do anything with it. That's rare, I assume. I assume that most people, when they get that rich, will build themselves a tower and show it off and set up a foundation and so on and so forth. Even if the foundation is cunningly disguised and is actually a money-making operation, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Yeah, that was just a small point.
Yeah, no, there's no clear line between any of these things, right? Human beings desire all of these things at once, and so it's best to talk about tendencies rather than absolute splits. But the desire for the beautiful, I mean, you can very clearly see that someone might work on their body a lot in order to be beautiful. But that's
so for a guy who's in the gym every day, it's like a beautiful body and strong and and just like good for your body unless you go way too far. So that has several parts to it.
Yeah.
Where's the honour of making money? I don't see anything wrong with it, but I don't see it as necessarily like honourable in and of itself. Maybe to provide, is that what you mean?
The thing, maybe in money making by itself, I mean, it should be purely instrumental, right? But it obviously becomes, for people who are making a lot of money, a means for them to be admired, rather than, you don't need more than one yacht, and that kind of thing. Like, it makes no sense. Like, to make more than $1 billion makes no sense. But they never stop. It's because they've received so and so much admiration for getting to there that they want to keep going.
But it's also, in some views, they must be smart that they can go from having nothing to be a billionaire, and also they provide all this work for all these other people.
True. That's fair.
Yeah, it's a deep confusion, though. I mean, those people, and they're often quite miserable because it's empty. It's ultimately empty. That's why their children, usually die of a fentanyl overdose with it. Yeah. No? Am I wrong?
Sometimes, often.
Okay, so then we have a passage that is reasonably famous in Platonic studies. I don't think the age is going to quote it or anything. In which she says that all of the rest is for the sake of this. She says, you, Socrates, bumbling fool, might get what I've said thus far, but as for the final revelations, again, intimation that Diotima professes a wisdom that Socrates himself, even having been her student, does not profess. As for the final revelations, to which these are a means. Now, if one pursues them correctly, she says, now I'll try and explain them. Now, this is on the level of the intellect, right? Or coming to understand or know or see the beautiful by itself or whatever, and we'll get to that passage. And that looks odd from a practical point of view, which is that don't you want to found a city so that people are just and happy and so on? There's a philosophical tradition which as far as I can see, only a few philosophers share, but Al-Farabi is definitely one of them. To pick the most recent example, he wrote a book called it's the size of a pamphlet, the Book of Letters, which is his interpretation of Aristotle's metaphysics, in which he says that all of the practical productive activity is for the sake of the theoretical activity. And which, if you said to someone, okay, the reason why you founded Amazon and you made those billions of dollars is so that I can have a grant and study philosophy metaphysics at a university. And so that's why he explicitly says, those studies which we took to be the useless ones are in fact the purpose of all the other ones. But he means the whole political community, the economy, families, all of that is for the sake of the three people who can philosophize. Now, I want to put it as bluntly as possible so you can reject it or qualify it or whatever. But that is the teaching of, there is a certain strand of classical philosophy that teaches that Maimonides, Al-Farabi, Aristotle, Plato, Xenophon. Xenophon ranks his own life lower than Socrates' life for that reason. And that's not our perspective, the contemporary, well, obviously. We have to justify every activity on the basis that it will help a large number of people. So of course we have to lie. We have to say you can have excellence and everyone can be comfortable in their mediocre opinion about themselves. You obviously can't, so you have to give up excellence. And we've taken that path because we want people to be comfortable in their mediocre opinions. And that's why our universities have banned thought and various other things like books written by non-morons. They're out, right? Okay, so but I want to make that explicit, this very different attitude. And okay, so now she says, try to follow, fool, if you can, the one who goes after this matter correctly. She said, must begin to go after, this is their colloquial American expression, go after beautiful bodies while he is still young. And if his guide guides him correctly, so at a couple of decisive points in the Platonic dialogues, a guide turns up out of nowhere. So you can't make your way without a guide, which is unhelpful because what if there's no guide, right? Okay. If the guide guides him correctly, he must first love one body and there bring forth beautiful speeches. Now, to be guided correctly means you don't just embrace this beautiful body, but you are prevented from embracing and instead produce sublime speeches, right? First step, right, is the sublimation of eros in speech. Second step is realizing that the beauty in one body is the same as the beauty in another body. This doesn't lead to contempt and promiscuity. It leads to a recognition that there is the character of the beautiful that is, the same. And that's what allows you to make the identification in the first place, that this is a beautiful human being. Result is a mental achievement, an intellectual achievement. It would be great folly not to regard the beauty of all bodies as one and the same. And having perceived this, he must take the position of a lover of all beautiful bodies and slacken this intense loving of one body by scorning it and regarding it as slight. Second step. Third step is he must regard the beauty in souls as more honourable than that in the body. So that even as someone who is decent in soul is more attractive than someone who is merely attractive in body. Right, and then at C4 he says, in order that the lover may be compelled to behold in turn, seeking out the person of this sort and to give birth to and search out the sort of speeches that would make the young better, in order that the lover may be compelled to behold in turn the beautiful in practices and laws. So there's been a kind of sublimation of the eros for the individual in the production of an understanding of what makes human beings per se excellent. Right. In order that he may regard the beautiful concerning the body to be something slight. So first of all, holding the beauty to be of the individual to be slight, because there's beauty that's in itself, and now to hold the beauty of the body per se. And after practices, so practices, we're now at the fifth part. The first, body. Second, form. Third, soul over body. Fourth, beauty in practices and laws. Fifth, which is where we are now, after practices, he must be led to the various kinds of knowledge or science, in order that he may in turn see the beauty of these, and may, in looking to the now vast, beautiful, no longer, like a household servant, cherish the beauty in one, whether of a little boy or some human or a single practice, and be a low-born and fussy-minded slave, but instead turn toward the vast sea of the beautiful and beholding it, give birth to many beautiful and magnificent speeches and thoughts in unstinting love of wisdom, which is, in Greek, it's the same word as philosophizing. That's step 5, and then we come to step 6. Until there, strengthened and matured, he may catch sight. That's a good, precise translation for the word, because it's catch sight of, as if out of the corner of your eye, of a single kind of knowledge, which has as its object the following kind of beauty. And now she says, try and focus, right? Try and understand this. Okay. Now, if you've read this, she's going to describe a kind of understanding of a kind of beauty that sounds like the Platonic form of beauty or something. The way she does it, though, is very careful, and the translation slightly muddies it. So it's 5 o'clock. I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this passage. We'll have a break. We can discuss Alcibiades' speech together, and discuss whatever you would like to discuss. Okay, so she says, whoever has been led. Tutored is a very precise translation of paedagogos, the person who used to take the young person to and from school. They used to lead them, but it's not tutored, it's led. Yeah. It's just different. Anyway, the person who's been led to this point in love matters and beholds beautiful things in order and correctly, will, as he now advances towards the end of erotic things, of love matters, suddenly come within sight of. So it's this word that means something like catch sight of. It doesn't mean you can view it or contemplate it steadily. Catch sight of, then this translation says something wondrous, beautiful in its nature. Whereas I would translate that phrase as something beautiful, wonderful in its nature. Either the same, yeah, it's very similar. Something, catch sight of some beauty that is worth wondering at in its nature, but just catch sight of it. And then she said, that very thing, Socrates, for the sake of which all these previous labors were undertaken. So what is that for the sake of which all these previous labors were undertaken? Now, there's a very odd sentence construction that begins partway through. We'll read the first part. First, this beautiful, always is and neither comes to be nor perishes. Neither does it wax or wane, grow or perish. Second, it's not in one way beautiful and another ugly, nor now beautiful, then not, nor beautiful in relation to one thing, ugly in relation to another. Nor here beautiful, there ugly, as if it were beautiful to some but ugly to others. Now, I just have to stop here. I hate to be annoying, but there's something somewhat important that happens in this sentence at precisely this point at 211a5. Okay, so at this part of the sentence, in this translation, it says, nor again will the beautiful show itself to him as some face or hands or anything else in which the body has a share. So the decisive verb here is show itself to him. Now, it's actually a word, phantasthetai, which means to give a phantasm, right? Nor will it show itself as an appearance. It won't have an appearance of the following, right? Now, what happens is that everything else follows from that verb down to B5, right? But that gets a bit slightly smudged in this sentence. So it won't provide the appearance, almost the illusion. A phantasm, if you read the Sophist, a phantasm is different from an icon. An icon is an accurate image, a phantasm is an inaccurate image. Nor will it give this fantastic appearance, right? Okay, so where are we? Nor will it show itself, give an appearance as some bodily part, nor will it give an appearance as an argument or one of the sciences or some kind of knowledge, nor will it give an appearance, and they say nor is it somehow in something else, but it's nor will it come to light in a phantasm somehow in something else, such as in an animal or in the earth or in the sky or anything else. But it will always come to light as a phantasm, as always itself by itself, with itself singular form. That's all under the, all following from this, that's all controlled by that same verb. But it will come to light as a phantasm, itself by itself, singular in form, being always. And all the other things will come to light as a phantasm by appearing beautiful, by sharing in it in some such way. And all the other things that are beautiful share in it in some such manner that, whereas these others are coming into being and perishing, it becomes neither any more nor any less. It comes to light as a phantasm, as neither becoming any more or any less, nor is affected in any other way at all. So Plato is having Socrates have Diotima describe very carefully the description of a thing in itself, a principle, one of the three that he usually discusses, the noble or the beautiful, the just, and the good, as a phantasm. Because as soon as you put it into speech, you no longer have the prediscursive apprehension of the thing, the catching sight of, she mentioned before, but you're constructing a phantasm. There's a very similar passage in the Phaedrus where Socrates says, I'm going to talk about the beings in themselves, and no poet has ever written a hymn, a poem about the beings in themselves in the hyper-Uranian, the external to the cosmos place where they are, and then he gives a description. So he gives a poetic description of what can't be given non-poetically, which is the source of all poetry or meaning. Okay, 7 past. We should stop. And I apologize for bringing in sentence construction, but there's something going on there that needs to be understood. Okay, let's have a break, and when you come back, we can discuss anything you'd like to discuss, any passages you'd like to discuss, and so on. And we have to discuss Alcibiades and his beautiful attempted seduction of Socrates. Okay, I'll speak with you shortly. Right. Yeah, I'm happy to discuss. If you want to go back to page 23 and discuss a paragraph, we should do that. If you have thoughts about the dialogue, do that. I want to read this one last passage, just because Socrates has Diotima use an expression famous from the Apology. And that's down here at 211 C to D. At C1, she says, for this indeed is what it means to pursue, to go after. These Americans are trying to be sort of colloquial and hip. To go after love matters correctly, or be led there by another. Right? Beginning from these beautiful things here, always to climb up for the sake of that beautiful there. But here and there, of course, poetic phantasms, as if making use of rungs from 1 to 2, and from the pair to all beautiful bodies, and from beautiful bodies to beautiful practices, and from practices to studies, sciences, and from these studies to end up at that study, which is the study of nothing else but that beautiful itself, so that ending there he might recognize that very thing the beautiful is. So that's knowing what something is, which will be the completion of a philosophical inquiry, which never gets completed in Plato, right? Now, then she says, life here, my dear Socrates, if anywhere, said the Mantinean stranger, that literally means the divinatory stranger, is worth living for a human being when he beholds the beautiful itself, which is, as I'm sure this footnote will tell us, is used in the Apology by Socrates, who says that he's talking to the audience, he's just been convicted, he's going to propose a penalty, and the penalty will be outrageous so that he's then condemned to death. And during the middle of this, he says, if I told you that I was doing what I'm doing because the god Apollo, through the Delphic oracle, told me to pursue this way of life, you wouldn't believe me on the ground that I'm being ironic, i.e. lying. If I told you the truth, which is that examining speeches about virtue, not being excellent, not being just and moderate, but examining speeches about virtue every day, as you hear me do, conversing with myself and others, that constitutes the highest good for a human being. And then he says, and that the life that is not spent in examination is not worthy of being lived by a human being. And that's where we get this expression here. You can translate it in 2 ways. Is worth living for a human being, or is not worthy of being lived by a human being. So it's the same expression. So Socrates in the Apology is saying the life worth being lived by a human being is one spent in the examination of logoi, or speeches, about human excellence. And then he has, the same person, Socrates, has Diotima say, when you arrive at knowing what the beautiful itself is. Now, he's characterized her as either professing or being either a wise or a sophist. And that appears to be, I take that fits here because she's talking about attaining wisdom about one of the principles of life rather than actually being on the way to it. That's just a suggestion, yeah. Now comes the passage where she divides seeing, looking upon and being with. If ever you see this, it won't seem to you comparable with golden garments or with those beautiful boys and youths at whose sight you are now stunned and prepared, you and many others, when you see your darling boys and are always with them. So being with and looking upon. Hi, Chris. Kirsten's on her way. Right. So you would always, okay, so looking upon and being with, neither to eat or drink, if that was somehow possible, but only to behold them and be with them always. Now, so, yeah. Okay, I just wanted to read that for that reason. Now, the people aren't quite as enthusiastic for this speech as they are for Agathon, who gets universal acclaim. Aristophanes tries to interrupt, but just as Aristophanes was overcome, at least pretended to be overcome by hiccups and couldn't speak, now he's not able to speak because he's interrupted by Alcibiades. So you could, if you wanted to be kind of symbolic, you could say the comic poet is overcome by the body and is subservient to political life. Alcibiades being the political figure. Now, Alcibiades has an amusing speech in which he separates Socrates' inside from his outside. He says the outside is ugly. He's always talking about cobblers and crafts and so on, whereas the inside is beautiful. The inside is what he says this phrase a couple of times, images of virtue, for example, moderation. How do I know that there are inside Socrates, there are images of moderation? Because I, the most beautiful human being in Athens, tried to seduce him and he wouldn't have a bar of it, right? And this gets Socrates completely wrong, right? Alcibiades has not seen at all the aspect of philosophy. He's completely misunderstood it and separates these two things, the speeches about the arts and the crafts, from the virtues, as if he has the virtues and this ugly exterior. And what he also does, and he does this 2 or 3 times, he speaks as if Socrates' speeches could be spoken by anyone and are separate from the conversation in which they occur. It's worth looking at one of those suggestions. Yeah. So he's comparing him to a satyr, Marsyas, and the Silenus, and he says, so this is at 215C. I'm just going to... So he says, you look like a satyr or a Silenus, and he says, but how are you not like him? Here at just before C1 at 215 C1, he says, you're not a flute player. He says, well, yes, you are, and a far more wondrous one than that satire. For he who would charm humans through instruments by the power of his mouth, as would anyone today who plays his songs on a flute. Where's the bit? Yeah, just down towards D. He says, at D, he says, you differ from him, the flute player, only to this extent that you produce the same effect through bare words without instruments. In our case, at any rate, whenever we hear someone else speaking, even a very good orator giving speeches on whatever topic, practically nobody cares in the slightest. But the moment anyone hears you or someone else repeating your speeches, That's the second time he's said that. So he thinks exactly like Apollodorus. He said at the very beginning of the dialogue, whenever I hear Socrates or someone speaking his arguments, right, as if these are separable. Well, what Plato is obviously trying to teach us that they're absolutely inseparable. Socrates is always talking to a particular person in a particular place and making a particular assent from particular opinions towards some perspective on the whole. They're not separable arguments. Right? So in some way, Alcibiades has not grasped that. But that's because his attention to them, I mean, he says, I'm overcome by them, right? And I feel like I'm enslaved by them. And he wants to escape this painful feeling. Why? Because they provoke the sense of a lack in him. And he doesn't want to, recognize that lack and then try to make up the lack, because the lack would be a lack of understanding. It isn't what he has no interest in trying to fill that lacuna. Okay, down at 216a, he says, when I used to hear Pericles and the other good orators, I considered that they spoke well, but I wouldn't be affected at all like this. My soul wouldn't be in an uproar, nor was it annoyed at my slavish condition. But I've been put in this state so often by this Marcius here, that it seemed to me that in my condition, life wasn't worth living. So the opposite of what Socrates and Diotima have talked about, making life worth living. Okay, we only have half an hour, so I'd really like to hear any of your thoughts. There are some, obviously there's pages that we haven't looked at, but some of it's myth-making, Socrates standing up all night, thinking, walking barefoot over the ice and so forth. Yes?
Mate, I've just got a question in relation to what we covered around 211A, I think, and those, sort of 210A and then 211A, those 6 phases there. And then we get to, I think, what I understood to be more or less, moving away from beauty in the specific and then taking on these notions of what is beautiful and all. And I'm only paraphrasing there, but that's sort of at the 211D, and sort of the sense that I got from those passages is an inclination to the concept of beauty as a standalone, separate from the subjective, and then contrasting that with what we've just seen in Alcibiades, and his mistaken understanding Socrates as being something that, and his speeches as being, I don't know whether I'm using the correct terms or not, as being universal, whereas in fact Socrates' speeches are always about the particular and always subjective and always dependent upon the specific circumstances. It almost seems, I mean, I'm not sure how they're meant to relate, but I'm just contrasting that approach where Alcibiades is incorrect in his understanding of Socrates as being anything approaching universal and objective and always being there, but always subject to the particular circumstances at the time, compared to what was discussed before about this aspect of love being something to be found without regard for the particular person in question, and rather a concept, a universal in itself. Is there a contrast there that's worth making, or are they two quite separate points?
I think that's good. That's good to put those two things together like that. Because, I just rephrase it, the same thought, but that Socrates has had Diotima describe Eros as being philosophical because it makes the whole a whole, but it doesn't comprehend the whole. Right? And that's what that's why she describes philosophy as correct opinion, hitting on and that's why she describes here hitting on, like touching on, glimpsing the beautiful and then having to make a phantasm to describe it. So that means that, you know, his conversations, they're never undirected. They always end up trying to see within whatever opinions he's confronted with that which is the case about beauty or courage or profit or whatever it is. But that means they're on the one hand, you know, as people always complain, he's always setting all these arguments in motion. He doesn't start from any stable position, but they're both they're grounded in opinion, therefore without a ground, and they're directed towards what those opinions reflect, and those opinions reflect our openness to the principles that are willingly guiding us.
Yeah.
Whereas,
That helped.
so therefore they can't be the same speeches because they're starting in such different positions. Whereas Alcibiades and Aristodemus think that these are portable speeches. You can just take this argument, use it in a different circumstance. Yeah.
Yep.
But I think what he's saying, when he talks about how astonished he is and he feels servile and so on, if you know, there are a couple of Alcibiades dialogues with Socrates, called helpfully the first Alcibiades and the second Alcibiades, and in both of them, he's in the first one, he's really made to expose his own erotic soul, which is expressed politically. He wants to control the world, right? You know, first he admits after some browbeating from Socrates that he wants to rule Athens, and then he admits he wants to rule Persia, and then, you know, he wants to run the world. And Socrates makes him, you know, through various extended arguments, see that if he was legitimately going to rule the world, he'd have to know a fair bit about, say, what justice is, and also how to run the silver mines and so on. And he in that dialogue, at the end of it, he says, okay, I'm going to follow you because what you have to say is of the central importance to me, in the same way he says that in this dialogue. But in this dialogue, he's managed to free himself from this, because what Socrates would lead up to is more argument, not action. And for him, that's servility, you know, being reduced to inaction. And he understands Socrates' excellence. He says these internal images of virtue, he understands them as endurance, you know, standing on the ice, thinking all night and so on, as endurance and moderation, because he refrains from having sex with Alcibiades. He doesn't understand that Socrates might have an eros for the conversation.
But it's kind of interesting that when Alcibiades invites him at the beginning, pick me up if I say anything wrong, and he describes all these things about him, he doesn't refute him at any point. You know, so maybe Socrates does accept that he's, you know, an enduring, strong character, he does these sorts of things. And even though you said before it's kind of the myth, part of the myth of Socrates, I wouldn't dispute that. But maybe it's a myth that has some grounding in historical Socrates.
Yeah, we don't actually have any outside evidence that we know Alcibiades was in Potidaea. So there's this war in the north for a couple of years before the start of the Peloponnesian War. We know he was there, but we don't. You know, Thucydides doesn't say there was also this old man who saved him.
Aren't there some in some of the dialogues, maybe not the Platonic dialogues, evidence that Socrates fighting him, the way he didn't go and pursue those people that he was asked to pursue?
Well, that was, you mean Leon or Salamis, where he's told by the tyrants to go and pick it. Yeah, but our evidence is just Platonic. But Plato is very, you know, he uses a lot of historically accurate, so we have no idea. Like it could be completely true. But my thought, it could be wrong, but my thought is that Alcibiades is misinterpreting these acts of moderation and endurance as being, like, that's the purpose, to have those virtues. But for Socrates, they're for the purpose of, the thinking of things through, or...
Yeah, but it's less that Alcibiades is misunderstanding Socrates. Like, he's sort of got his number, but he's showing great self-awareness by saying, all of the things that he's saying about Socrates is not really about Socrates. It's more about how confronted he feels and lacking.
Yeah.
It's more about Alcibiades.
Yeah, and so, but what do you conclude about Alcibiades from...
Well, he primarily characterizes Socrates' position as showing up how Alcibiades is neglectful of the city. And
Of the city?
well, doesn't he say that he doesn't, he's not somebody who's going to go into the public space and draw out people's thoughts on things, or...
Who?
Alcibiades.
Yeah, but he's definitely a public figure. Like, that's his whole life.
Yeah, of course, and there is the fact that he does actually betray Athens, but that's not what he's talking about either. He's saying that he feels short about not paying attention to the Athenian mind or the Athenian people. Nah.
Whereabouts is that you're looking at?
Yeah, I don't know. I immediately can't find it.
Yeah, while you're looking, I'm just going to go ahead to 216D. At 216C, he says, at the beginning of this new paragraph about 216C5, and so I and many others have been affected in this way by this satyr's flute songs. But as for the rest, hear from me now how similar he is to those figures I likened him to, and how wondrous is the power he possesses. For bear in mind that none of you knows this man, but I shall reveal him. Since I've made a start, I will reveal him. You see a Socrates who's erotically disposed towards beautiful men, and is always around these types and is stunned by them, and who, furthermore, is ignorant of everything and knows nothing. That's the outward appearance he puts on. Right? That he's attracted to the beautiful, and that he knows nothing. Now, Alcibiades says, is this not Silenus-like? Of course it is. For he's wrapped this appearance around himself on the outside, just like the moulded Silenus. But once he's opened up, gentlemen and fellow drinkers, symposiists, do you have any idea how full of moderation he is on the inside? Know that he doesn't care at all if someone is beautiful. He scorns this more than anyone can imagine. Right? Nor does he care whether someone is wealthy or has any other honor had by those who are thought blessed by the multitude. He regards all these possessions as worth nothing, and us, I'm telling you, as nothing too. And he carries on his whole life being ironic and playing with humans. Now that's Alcibiades, but it's hard not to see there is obviously some aspect of the truth. Socrates appears to be pretending to be interested in people who have things that are conventionally honoured. And what's this expression? He carries on his whole life being ironic and playing with humans. So irony is a kind of play, because it means to disguise, to disguise yourself. Now, Strauss, when he talks about Socrates' irony, says he refers to Aristophanes' description of irony as one of the extremes of telling the truth, which is either boasting or being ironic, which is hiding something that is excellent in yourself. And Strauss therefore concludes the decisive excellence is wisdom. And so irony in Socrates is the disguise of wisdom. But I don't think we want to introduce Aristotle at this point, because I think it goes deeper than that. Like, he is being playful with people, even if he's trying to manipulate people into thinking for themselves or whatever. He deceives people entirely about his intentions.
Martin, I'd like to ask two things. The first one is just after that thing you've just quoted, where Alcibiades says, if you look inside Socrates, I don't know if anyone has seen, this is just before and just after 217A1.
Yeah.
If you look inside him, these images, I saw them once and they were so divine, golden, completely beautiful and amazing. You just had to do just about whatever Socrates commanded. So can you just say a word about that expression, the images within? So that's my question, first question.
Well, so in the first place, it refers to this notion that you can crack open this statue and there are little images of gods, right, in the Silenus. So in Socrates, there is this external ugliness, playing with human beings, pretending to be attracted to the beautiful when he's not. Like, for example, moi, right? I took him to dinner. I got rid of the servants, and so on and so forth. Nothing. And Alcibiades regards that as a great act of hubris against his great charm. Now, so the images inside, which are so utterly golden, what are they for Alcibiades? That's when, because what follows immediately is the failed seduction. So he thinks that Socrates is moderate out of some kind of ethical virtue. During that attempted seduction, when he's failing, this is at 219 E, D to E, Alcibiades, we'll go there, is saying to Socrates at 219D, so he invites him over for the first time for dinner and he leaves. And he says, I was ashamed and let him go. So I schemed once more to get him to come over for dinner. After we had dined, I went on conversing far into the night, and when he wanted to leave, I made out that it was too late and compelled him to stay. It reminds me of some kind of song about the temperature outside. Does that ring any bells? He then took his rest on the couch next to mine, the one he was on during dinner, and no one was sleeping in the room but us. Now then he tells him about what he's going to call Socrates' splendidly arrogant deed, which is to refuse him. And we're going to come down to 219D, where he says, at 219C to D, Alcibiades says, you're the only lover that's proved worthy of me. But you appear to be shy about mentioning the fact that you would like us to get together, right? And then at D, he says, I would feel a far worse shame before sensible people if I didn't gratify such a man as you than before the many, and foolish if I did. Now then, because he's just said nothing is more important to me than to become as good as possible. Socrates says, and when he heard this, Socrates said in his translation, oh so ironic way, ironizing with me, which was very much his own and habitual, my dear Alcibiades, perhaps you're not in fact so dim. If what you say about me turns out to be true, and there is in me a certain power through which you might become better, Surely you must see in me a disarming beauty that far surpasses the lovely form that dwells with you. If in catching sight of this, you're trying to get a share in what I have and to exchange beauty for beauty, you mean to gain no small advantage of me. So you're ripping me off, right? Because Alcibiades is saying, look, whatever you need, me, my body, my friends, my finances is yours, because you can make me a better human. And Socrates says, well, in that case, you're swapping iron for silver, right? Or gold for bronze, to use the exact expression. Okay, so last part of this. Right, and then at, where are we now? We're at 219B. 219A. After hearing this, I said, that's how things stand with me. Nothing I've said is different from what I think, but for your part, consider what you think is best for you and for me. And here Socrates says, that at least was well put. For in the days to come, we shall consider and do what appears best with both about this and other matters. Now, he thinks he's begun to seduce him, and he hasn't. That's because he doesn't understand that Socrates actually wants to consider what's best. It's not just a front, right? That appears to be what Plato is suggesting, that Socrates genuinely is interested in Alcibiades for some reason. Right? It could be a political experiment. Like, how far can someone who is merely a political person, who cannot become philosophical, how far can they be influenced by philosophy? And there's something similar is happening with Agathon. So when Alcibiades comes in and he notices Socrates, he's made to sit between them and gives a praise of Socrates. Then later on, this is at 222D, Socrates says, everything you've done is to try and separate me and Agathon. You think I have to love you and no one else, and that Agathon has to be loved by you and by no one else. And you haven't gotten away with it, blah, blah. There is a passage here where at the end of his speech at 222B, Alcibiades says, that's why I'm telling you all this, Agathon, so you won't be tricked by Socrates. Right, and Socrates objects and says, that's what your entire speech was a disguise to try and separate the two of us, Agathon and Socrates. And that's why Socrates doesn't want to change the seating order, because he will now get a chance to praise Agathon. And I think that would probably be a way of trying to influence Agathon. I mean, why has he come to Agathon's party and dressed up for it and sat on the porch outside to delay his entrance dramatically and figure out something? It appears, and these are just hints, but in the Phaedrus, he talks to this young man Phaedrus who has a speech of Lysias under his cloak. He gets him to read the speech because he doesn't want to hear what Lysias has memorized. He wants to read the act. But the whole point of Socrates talking to him, he says, is to get Phaedrus to go back and tell Lysias to write speeches in a different way. It appears that the person who doesn't write wants to have some influence possibly on the poets. Definitely on Agathon here in the Symposium. And that's, if we come to the last passage. which is 223D, D2. Aristodemus said he didn't remember all of what was said since he wasn't there at the beginning and was nodding off. That's unfortunate because the two poets, the greatest comedian of antiquity, and a second rate. Second is very high. The first rank is Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles. Second rank, Agathon and a few others, discussing poetry with Socrates. It would have been helpful to have that, but Aristodemus fell asleep. However, the gist of it, he said, was that Socrates was compelling them to agree that one and the same man should know how to make comedy and tragedy. I think I've mentioned in the first expression we have, the comedy and tragedy of life, is in the Philebus, and that he who is by art a maker of tragedy is also a maker of comedy. That's by art a maker of. That's a very careful qualification, though. So there's this continuous discussion in the dialogues. Do poets make what they make by art or by a kind of, I don't want to say inspiration, because then the inspiration is turned into, but by some kind of pre-rational apprehension. So what would it be to make a tragedy by art? Because when tragedy is discussed in Book 10 of the Republic, it's not art, it's appealing to the emotions of the demos. Right? Their fondness for seeing their own suppressed emotions, their own suppressed fearfulness and pity and so on, seeing that fully expressed. And then Aristotle turns that into the purpose of tragedy, which is it's meant to evoke pity and fear in order to purge those things. Catharsis, kathareuo, means to purge, to wash out.
Could I grab the microphone? So I don't want to waylay us on a different course, but I was really struck by the distinction and the tension between being with and gazing upon. And I was wondering if we could explore that just a little more, because it made me think of a passage in Proust's In Search of Lost Time, where he's fallen in love with this girl named Albertine, and he goes to kiss her. And as he's going to kiss her, he's looking at her face and he's taking in her face. But the closer he gets, the less of her face that he can see, until at the moment where he kisses her, her face is completely obscured by his proximity to her. And I thought,
yeah, that's perfect.
That tension perfect. Is kind of seems implicit in Plato as well. And I just wanted to see whether this idea in Proust is similar to Plato. In Proust, I think what's going on, this is my interpretation at any rate, is Proust is comfortable with the gazing upon because he can take what he wants out of Albertine, her subjectivity, her freedom, and turn it into an object of his knowledge. But the problem is that he loses her subjectivity and her freedom in turning her into an object of his gaze, so to speak. And so that's sort of a tension in Proust at any rate. And I'm just wondering how do those same dynamics play out in the case of Plato?
Yeah. In a parallel manner. So Aristophanes gives everything to being with, as Eros. Eros is to be with. And he has Hephaestus stand by the two lovers and say, you can't say what you want. Right? So that means, that has several meanings, one of which is that our original nature that we're aspiring to is pre-linguistic, which is, that makes sense. Like, it's with the gods that we have language and laws and so on, and specifically human sexuality. The gods, only the Olympian gods have human sexuality, and we're like them. Right? So if Eros was successful, it's the extinction of the erotic being. It becomes a part of a whole. So the longing for wholeness is the extinction, if it's achieved. And that's why he says, when the couple embrace, he says, there is the greatest feeling of intimacy, being with one's own, and eros, because they know they're part, as opposed to the original wholes. Right? Now, Agathon takes himself to have transcended the distinction between the looking upon and the being with. By means of beautiful poetry, he can charm the mind so that everything becomes one's own. Let's go back to the end of his poem. At 197 D1, he says, he's defined Eros as a poet. What does a poet do? Makes what is not one's own by charming the mind. Right? And he says, I'm now moved to make poetry. He says, peace among humans, right? A windless calm on the open sea, repose, bedtime. It's not, so he's giving a human quality to the winds. Repose of the winds, bedtime for the winds, right? Putting the winds to sleep, and sleep for us amid care. Sleep amid care, not awareness of the cares, right? So then the next line is, it is he who empties us of alienation of otherness and fills us with the sense of one's own. So Aristophanes says, the longing we feel in Eros is a longing for one's own that's impossible. It's like Rousseau, like our original being is pre-linguistic, pre-social, prehistorical, right? We have a longing for a wholeness that we can never have back because just being part of a society divides us. That's exactly what Aristophanes means. Right? Having laws and customs and principles makes us split human beings. But to have that wholeness would destroy our ability to be social and so on. That's exactly what Rousseau means. And that's why there's this like evanescent half-light of what he calls the noble savage before they're fully civilized, where we're human, but we're much stronger and more authentically, ourselves. Now, but Agathon is saying, by making everything beautiful, I can free it of alienation. Now, but Socrates wants to restore this tension. There is a love of one's own and a love of the good, which is not that. It's not the fundamental love is the love of the good, not of to have everything be one's own. Hence the homelessness. What is good is fundamentally not one's own. Like one's own laws and customs and practices in the city may not be good. One's arm or leg may not be good, as he said. But I haven't stated any of that with clarity. But what your suggestion is the right suggestion. Like that's I think one of the decisive ways to try and understand the difference between Aristophanes, Agathon, and Socrates. Yeah.
Well, I suppose one point I quickly make is that it's in Proust at any rate. Not that this is a class on Proust. this is what I was worried about, waylaying the class on different directions.
I think we should now pick up In Search of Lost Time and start at the beginning.
Yeah, you'd have a 6-year course on
yes.
3,000 page book. Well, at any rate, in Proust, there's this tension even within the gazing upon, where I suppose this is really what you've just explored, but it's inherent in that aspect of the gazing upon as well, that you're searching for something that you can't ultimately have. You want the other person's freedom, but in turning them into an object of your knowledge, you're reducing their subjectivity down to a kind of object of knowledge. And well, at any rate, it doesn't really end well for Proust, because it's again, the same tension is replicated within the intellectual domain as well. And it seems like the solution has to be to transcend the dichotomy between the two in some way. And well, I mean, that's another conversation, but I thought I would just mention that.
Yeah, that's helpful. We actually reached 6.
Yes.
But please, if you have to depart, please, I apologize for running over time. Please depart. And yeah, thanks for sticking around thus far. We can carry on talking. A brief advertisement. We have a course on Hamlet starting in about a month, I think, if you're at all interested. I think it's the same time and place for Hamlet. And then in August, we have a couple of courses we have the course on the pre-Socratics, with some ancient Greek language. And we also have a course on Antigone in English. We will read an English translation. If you have Greek, we'll have another separate course, reading the play in Greek. But we have a course reading the play in English and discussing that. But both the Hamlet course and the Antigone course, we're going to discuss with some excerpts, brief excerpts from Aristotle and Hegel and Nietzsche on tragedy. I think those, probably our 3 greatest thinkers about tragedy. And so just to give us some way, as a way in of understanding what is tragic about Hamlet's fate and Antigone's fate. But yeah, that's what's coming up if you have any interest. But yeah, thank you for sticking around, and I'll stop recording. How do I do that?